Chapter 4: Evolution, Biological Communities, and Species Interactions. Do you remember our definitions of species, population, and community from Chapter 3? How about the flow of energy between trophic levels? For those to occur, we discussed how feeding is the driving force. Because feeding requires different species to interact, ecologists often study the interactions to try to understand how the system works. This is important because interactions such as predation or competition are driving forces in the gradual change in species over time. It is important for us to understand these interactions if we want to understand the impacts humans have on those systems. Darwin is accredited for finding a mechanism that explained how, and in a way why, species change over time. At the root of his research was the idea of adaptation. Systems are dynamic and constantly changing in natural systems. If a species is to survive, it must adapt to those changes. Adaptation is just the development of traits in a population that helps the population survive in the environment in which it is found. Adaptation occurs as a series of traits becomes more or less common in a population. If a trait is beneficial, meaning it helps a species survive in a system, that trait will be selected for within the population, thereby becoming more common over time. Those differences occur because all species have subtle differences in the DNA within individuals of that species. The differences, called mutations, allow some to be more adapted while others are less adapted. Selection favors the better adapted individuals. Over time, these mutations, which are passed from parent to offspring, influence reproductive success. Those with better success, more desirable traits, produce offspring at a higher rate than those with less desirable traits. Over time, these mutations accumulate to a point that the organisms with those traits can no longer successfully reproduce with the parent population. At this point, a new species has developed. This is the backbone of evolution in a Darwinian world. Related to speciation are the concepts of abundance, complexity, and diversity. Complexity is the number of trophic levels in a system and the number of species at each trophic level. As we saw in the last chapter, very complex systems have very complicated food webs. However, this complexity imparts stability on the system. Abundance is simply the number of organisms in an area. However, a community with a high degree of abundance is not necessarily complex. For example, I may have a high number of individuals within one species, but I may not have many species across many trophic levels. Diversity, on the other hand, is a measure of the relationship between complexity and diversity. However, there are several types of diversity. The one most often used is species diversity. This is really just a measure of abundance. Genetic diversity is a measure of the genetic variability within a population. Ecological diversity includes the living species, but also the non-living measures such as complexity and energy levels. Typically, as you move from the poles to the equators, ecological diversity increases, as does genetic and species diversity. If reproductive success is influenced by traits, what forces impact those traits to make one more successful than the other? The answer is the environment or habitat in which a species lives. To be successful, they must be able to function in their environment. That tends to cause organisms to develop a role or niche in that environment or habitat. A species can have a generalized or very specific role or niche. For example, hummingbirds are very specialized for eating the nectar of flowers. Crows, on the other hand, are very generalized and can eat almost anything. However, crows and hummingbirds do not eat the same thing. This is important because competition is a very important force or interaction driving evolution and adaptation. So much so that no two species can be 100% competitors and still exist in the same area. As you will see on the next slide, this is known as the competitive exclusion principle in ecology. To avoid competitive exclusion, species partition out resources to avoid competition. Just keep in mind that when we say resource, it can almost mean anything. For example, time is a resource, so I can avoid competition by going about my business at a different time of day compared to another very similar species. Competitive exclusion. An illustration of resource partitioning. As we mentioned earlier, selection can lead to the formation of a new species. This process is called speciation. There are two main types of speciation, allopatric and sympatric. The main difference between the two is the presence of geographic isolation as a key factor in the speciation. If there is geographic isolation, then it is all allopatric. If not, it is sympatric. The majority of animal speciation is probably by allopatric speciation, but plants often undergo sympatric speciation. An illustration of allopatric speciation on a single population and on geographically isolated populations. In sympatric speciation, organisms continue to live in the same place but become isolated by some other means. For example, some fern species have doubled the number of chromosomes they have. This prevents them from breeding with the population from which they originally came and effectively creates a new species. Regardless of the form of speciation, there are three main types: directional, stabilizing, and disruptive. Remember that when we talk about adaptation and speciation, we are talking about a change in some trait. In directional speciation, the trait tends to progress to one extreme or another. For example, for giraffes, neck and leg lengths that were long were favored over those that were short. It allowed taller ancestral giraffes to feed above the other herbivores, which reduced competition. Over time, giraffes became taller and taller. Selection is this example, favored taller over shorter. The direction of height was towards the tall extreme. Conversely, human babies survive better if they are not too big and not too small at birth. Too big and they get caught in the birth canal, potentially killing the baby and mother. Too small and they are not very likely to survive. Human birth weights in the middle have been favored. This is stabilizing selection. The average is selected for. The last example is when the average is selected against and both extremes are selected for. This is common in a very patchy environment where it is better to be one extreme or the other. Continuing our discussion of species interaction, we have several types. For the most part, the main forms we study are competition and predation. A third form that has been gaining much attention lately is mutualism. Competition can be either within a species, intra, or between two or more different species, inter. If we remember the competitive exclusion principle, regardless of the type, species cannot be 100% alike and live in the same area. Both affect adaptation and speciation. Most people know the rule of the jungle as eat or be eaten. Actually, the rule is eat and be eaten. The effect predation has on reproductive success should be obvious. If I am dead because something ate me, then I can't reproduce. Traits that reduce my risk of predation therefore should increase my reproductive success. Those traits will be selected for. Alternatively, any trait that makes me more efficient and successful as a predator will also be served for. In this sense, predation is a double-edged sword. Prey are constantly trying to avoid predation while predators are constantly trying to become better predators. Ecologists describe this as a runaway arms race. This is an example of coevolution. We also see coevolution with mutualism. As predators become more efficient, the prey evolves defenses, thorns, toxic chemicals, etc. Over time, predator and prey evolve in response to one another. This is called coevolution. Species with chemical defenses often evolve warning coloration. Harmless species mimic the warning coloration of harmful species to gain protection. Two harmful species evolve to look alike. An illustration of Barthesian mimicry. In the last interaction, two or more species live in very tight association with each other. This association can be beneficial to both like bees and flowers, mutualism, beneficial to one but not beneficial or harmful to the other, orchids growing in trees, or parasitism, where one is harmed and one benefits. Some ecologists would argue that parasitism is a special kind of predation. Can you explain why? An illustration of symbiosis. As we discussed earlier, a resource that may lead to speciation does not always have to be food. It can be time, day or night, or even distrib space. We see the results of space as a competitive resource when looking at the distribution in space of individuals in the population or community. Usually demonstrate a clustered, random, or uniform distribution. In a uniform distribution, individuals or populations tend to have an even amount of space around them. Clustered is also known as clumped, and it occurs when resources are clumped. Random distribution occurs when no resources are affecting the distribution of an organism or species. This pattern is usually rare unless a new area opens up for colonization. An illustration of community structure. The last thing we need to cover are communities in transition. Community stability is usually related to diversity. The more diverse a community, the more stable it will be. However, what do we mean by stability? In the context, stability is related to the ability of a community to respond after a disturbance. The more diverse, the faster it can recover. With that in mind, though, we also have to think about the level of disturbance. Is there a remnant of the prior community still present? Was the disturbance so severe the previous community was completely destroyed? When a community recovers, it typically does so in a relatively fixed order. If no prior community exists, this process is called primary succession. Primary succession is characterized by the absence of any prior community and may also be lacking in soil. The first species to colonize this sterile area are called pioneer species. These are often lichens and mosses. If an existing community is disrupted, for example, an area of forest is clear-cut, the process of community restoration is called secondary succession. This is typically much faster than primary succession because soil and remnants of the prior community already exist. A climax community is the last state to develop and tends to persist unless there is another disturbance. For terrestrial systems, we typically name them after the predominant vegetation. For example, a temperate broadleaf forest or grassland, prairie. An illustration of primary succession. One type of disturbance that can have lasting impacts are the introduction of introduced species. These are species that do not occur naturally in an area but are released, intentionally or accidentally, through the results of human activities. These species, if they become established, can wreak havoc on a system, since the system did not evolve with them. Introduced species have the potential to fundamentally change an ecosystem.